To understand the extraordinary act of sacrifice undertaken by Witold Pilecki, we must first comprehend the world into which he was born and the Europe he inhabited during the turbulent interwar years. The period from 1918 to 1939 was marked by profound instability, ideological collision, and the gradual ascension of totalitarian regimes whose ambitions would reshape the continent through warfare and genocide. Poland, in particular, found itself in an exceptionally precarious position, a nation reborn from the ashes of empires, surrounded by powerful adversaries, each harboring territorial claims on Polish territory. The resurrection of Poland as an independent state came in November 1918, following the simultaneous collapse of three empires: the German Reich, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and the Russian Tsarist autocracy. For 123 years, Poland had ceased to exist as a political entity, partitioned among imperial powers. When Marshal Józef Pilsudski proclaimed Polish independence on November 11, 1918, he faced a nation economically devastated by 4 years of continental warfare, ethnically diverse with competing national allegiances, and geographically vulnerable between two powerful neighbors, Germany to the west and the emerging Soviet Union to the east. Between 1919 and 1921, Poland fought for its very survival in a desperate war against Bolshevik Russia, seeking to secure its eastern frontier against Soviet expansion. This conflict, known as the Polish-Soviet War, was particularly fierce and ideologically charged. It represented not merely a territorial dispute, but a civilizational struggle between Polish nationalism and communist internationalism. Young Polish cavalry officers, including those who would later lead Polish resistance, gained their initial military experience in these brutal campaigns. The war ended with Polish victory, and the Treaty of Riga in March 1921 established Poland's eastern borders roughly along the so-called Curzon Line. Yet the early Polish Republic, formally established by the Constitution of 1921, was marked by profound political fragmentation. Between 1919 and 1926, Poland cycled through 12 different governments, a pattern reflecting deep ideological divisions among Catholic conservatives, socialists, agrarian parties, and nationalist movements. This instability reached a crisis point in 1926, when Marshal Pilsudski, aging but still revered as the architect of Polish independence, orchestrated a military coup d'état. Though Pilsudski presented himself as a guardian of national stability rather than a dictator, the May coup inaugurated the Sensacja regime, meaning cleansing or healing, an authoritarian system that increasingly centralized power, restricted democratic processes, and limited press freedoms. The Pilsudski regime, lasting until his death in 1935, nonetheless undertook significant modernization initiatives. The government developed the Baltic port of Gdynia as an alternative to Danzig, which remained under League of Nations administration. Pilsudski's administration established the Central Industrial District, Centralny Okręg Przemysłowy, in central Poland, a massive military-industrial complex designed to concentrate armaments production away from Poland's vulnerable borders. The regime invested heavily in railroad infrastructure and aviation capacity. These initiatives reflected Polish military theorists' anxiety about German power and the recognition that Poland could survive only through rapid modernization and concentrated defensive preparation. The economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, beginning in 1929, devastated Poland as it did throughout Europe. Industrial production collapsed, unemployment soared to catastrophic levels, agricultural prices plummeted. This economic desperation provided fertile ground for radical political movements. Across Europe, democracy weakened as authoritarian and fascist movements gained adherents. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascist regime had consolidated totalitarian power since 1922, establishing the first European model of a one-party state based on ultranationalism, militarism, and hierarchical state control. In Germany, the Depression intensified the appeal of Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party. After Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, he rapidly transformed Germany into a totalitarian dictatorship, openly violated the Treaty of Versailles through rapid rearmament, and began implementing an explicitly racialized ideology that targeted Jews, Slavs, and Communists as existential enemies. Poland's response to rising German power was constrained by economic weakness and geopolitical isolation. The Polish military, despite significant efforts at modernization, remained under-equipped and underfunded. While Polish cavalry was not merely mounted riders, but a sophisticated combined arms force capable of rapid deployment and tactical flexibility, it could not match the emerging Wehrmacht's mechanized divisions and the Luftwaffe's air superiority. Polish military theorists understood that war with Germany would likely be catastrophic. By 1939, Polish society was deeply polarized, yet united in national consciousness. The Catholic Church remained a central institution, and Polish nationalism was intensely felt across all social classes. Poland was home to Europe's largest Jewish community, approximately 3.3 million Jews, comprising roughly 10% of the population. Though Jewish presence in Polish lands extended back centuries, the interwar period witnessed rising anti-Semitic sentiment among portions of the Catholic majority and within nationalist political movements. These tensions would become tragically relevant to subsequent events. As German aggression intensified in 1938 and 1939, Polish military and intelligence officers began constructing underground resistance networks even before invasion became inevitable. On September 1, 1939, German armies attacked Poland with overwhelming force. The Wehrmacht deployed approximately 1.5 million troops supported by devastating air superiority. Poland's armed forces, numbering roughly 400,000 active personnel plus reservists, were organized defensively but lacked modern equipment and sufficient mechanization. By early October 1939, organized Polish military resistance had collapsed. Warsaw surrendered on October 2nd. Soviet forces, advancing from the east as stipulated in the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, swiftly occupied eastern Polish territory. In less than 4 weeks, the Polish state ceased to exist as an independent entity. The nation was divided between German and Soviet zones of occupation. Hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers were captured or killed. Yet it was precisely in this moment of national catastrophe that Polish officers like Witold Pilecki resolved to continue their struggle through underground warfare.
Witold Pilecki was born on May 13, 1901, in Olonets, a remote town in northern Russia, specifically in the Karelia region, far from the ancestral Polish homeland he would later fight to liberate. This unusual birthplace was not a consequence of personal choice, but of historical exile. The Pilecki family, along with the Osia-Chimskis through his mother's line, had participated in the January Uprising of 1863, a desperate and ultimately crushed rebellion against Russian imperial rule. When Tsar Alexander II's forces suppressed the uprising, the Russian Empire exacted brutal revenge through systematic repression, political executions, and wholesale confiscation of noble estates. Witold's paternal grandfather, Josef Pilecki, was sentenced to 7 years of Siberian exile. The family's ancestral lands near Novogrudek were permanently confiscated. Witold's father, Julian Pilecki, was born into this atmosphere of dispossession and political defeat. Unable to find meaningful employment in Russian-controlled Poland, Julian pursued forestry education at the prestigious Petersburg Institute of Forestry in St. Petersburg, a choice reflecting both practical necessity and the cosmopolitan opportunities available to Polish nobility within the Russian Empire. In St. Petersburg, Julian met his future wife, Ludwika Osia-Chimska. herself a member of a patriotic Polish family with a history of anti-Russian activity. After their marriage, Julian accepted appointment as a senior forestry inspector in the remote Olonets district. There, in the frozen forests of northern Russia, 5 children were born: Maria, Joseph, who died at age 5, Witold, Wanda, and Georgi. Though Witold spent his early childhood in Russia, isolated from Polish territory, his mother ensured the children remained connected to their national identity through deliberately patriotic education. Ludwika read to her children works by Henryk Sienkiewicz, the great Polish novelist whose historical novels celebrated Polish heroism, and recited patriotic poetry to them. These acts of quiet cultural resistance, practiced within the family's private sphere, profoundly shaped young Witold's worldview and his identification with Polish national consciousness. In 1910, when Witold was 9 years old, the family relocated to Vilnius, then the capital of the Russian-controlled Vilna region, but culturally and linguistically Polish. There, Witold attended a commercial school, where he demonstrated aptitude for mathematics and languages. More significantly, he joined the clandestine Polish Scouting movement, organizations technically illegal under Tsarist rule, but essential to maintaining Polish national consciousness among youth. These scout groups conducted military-style training, inculcated patriotic values, and prepared youth for potential armed service in a future independent Poland. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 scattered the Pilecki family once again. During a family vacation to the Lithuanian spa town of Druskianiki, news of German invasion made it impossible for Ludwika and the children to return safely to Vilnius or reach Julian in the northern regions. They retreated to the family's recovering ancestral estates in Mogilewszczyzna, in the Polish-Lithuanian borderlands, where they sheltered during the chaos of the war years. The year 1918 brought the realization of Polish independence, a prize for which generations had struggled and sacrificed. With the simultaneous collapse of the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires, Poland re-emerged as a sovereign nation for the first time in more than 100 years. Witold Pilecki, now 17 years old, possessed a burning determination to serve his newly liberated country. In March 1920, having just completed his high school examinations, he enlisted as a common cavalry soldier in Poland's newly formed National Army, fighting directly in the pivotal Vilna offensive against Bolshevik forces advancing westward in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921. At the Battle of Vilna and in subsequent operations, Pilecki's cavalry unit participated in desperate defensive actions and partisan operations behind Soviet lines. His courage and tactical competence earned him early recognition. Though not a graduate of an officer cadet academy, his 14 months of continuous frontline service between 1918 and 1921 resulted in his commission as an officer. Subsequently, he served in the Zeligovsky Rebellion, a covert Polish operation in 1920 to 1921 aimed at establishing leverage in territorial disputes with Lithuania. During operations in the Rudniki Forest near Azychishki, Pilecki distinguished himself in combat, leading a successful assault on enemy machine gun positions and capturing 80 Bolshevik soldiers. After the war concluded, Pilecki settled on his family's ancestral estate in Sukorcze, near the town of Lida, in eastern Poland. There, he became the estate's administrator, personally managing lands that his family had reclaimed after over 50 years of Russian exile and confiscation. Pilecki was not merely a military officer, He was a talented artist who sketched designs and painted religious images for his local parish church. By the late 1920s, he had married Maria Ostrovska and begun raising a family. In 1937, by then a middle-aged officer with 2 decades of military service, Pilecki was promoted to the rank of cavalry captain, rotamist, and appointed commander of the 19th Infantry Division's Lida Cavalry Squadron. He participated in major divisional exercises under the command of General Stefan Dub Biernatsky. By September 1939, Witold Pilecki was a seasoned cavalry officer with extensive combat experience spanning 2 decades, an established reputation for integrity and decisive action, and a profound, unshakable commitment to Polish independence and national survival.
Following the German invasion of Poland in September 1939 and the rapid collapse of organized Polish military resistance, Witold Pilecki made a critical decision. Rather than accepting defeat or attempting escape to the west, he would remain in occupied Poland and continue the struggle through underground warfare. This decision would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life and ultimately contribute to documentation of the Holocaust. By early October 1939, Pilecki had reached Warsaw, the now devastated capital of German-occupied Poland. Warsaw had endured brutal siege warfare. German bombardment had caused massive civilian casualties and destroyed large sections of the city. Polish military units had either been destroyed in combat, captured, or dispersed. Yet even as the city smoldered, Polish officers and intellectuals began organizing underground resistance networks. The immediate goal was to preserve Polish military organization and prepare for eventual liberation. The longer-term goal was to gather intelligence on German occupation policies and maintain Polish national consciousness under foreign rule. In October 1939, Pilecki established contact with the emerging underground apparatus in Warsaw. He connected with Major Jan Błudakewicz, a fellow cavalry officer and founder of an underground organization called the Secret Polish Army, Tajna Armia Polska, TAP, established in November 1939. TAP was exclusively military in composition. It drew its membership primarily from Polish army officers and non-commissioned officers who had survived the September campaign. TAP's fundamental purpose was to establish a military organization capable of coordinating Polish armed resistance to German occupation while simultaneously gathering intelligence on German military capabilities, occupation administration, and German atrocities. Using the assumed identity of Tomasz Serafiński, the name of an actual Polish soldier killed during the September campaign, Pilecki worked for TAP throughout 1939 and early 1940, helping to establish intelligence networks and organize clandestine military cells in Warsaw. Pilecki performed his duties with characteristic efficiency and discretion. In the clandestine world of occupied Warsaw, security was paramount. Discovery meant arrest, interrogation, torture, and probable execution. Despite these extreme dangers, Pilecki helped TAP establish communication networks with Polish military elements in other occupied territories and began gathering intelligence on German military dispositions and occupation policies. By the summer of 1940, TAP faced a critical problem. Several of its senior members, including officers known to Pilecki, had been arrested by German security forces and deported to a newly established concentration camp at Auschwitz in southern Poland. Auschwitz had begun operations in June 1940, initially receiving Polish political prisoners and military prisoners of war. TAP leadership, particularly Major Błudakewicz, recognized that the camp represented a black hole of information. Little was known about conditions inside Auschwitz, the numbers of prisoners being held there, or the regime's ultimate intentions regarding the concentration camp system. In August 1940, Błudakewicz called a confidential meeting with trusted subordinates, including Pilecki. the Major posed an extraordinary and dangerous proposition. TAP needed an officer to infiltrate Auschwitz, establish an underground military organization within the camp, gather detailed intelligence about conditions and German practices, and communicate this information to the outside world. The assignment was plainly suicidal. Entry to Auschwitz was virtually certain death. Pilecki solicited volunteers for this mission. Witold Pilecki volunteered immediately. Pilecki's decision to volunteer for such a mission reflected several factors. First was his patriotic commitment to Poland. He believed that detailed intelligence about German concentration camp operations might prove valuable to Polish military leadership and potentially to the Western Allies. Second, Pilecki possessed exceptional organizational abilities and courage. Having survived military combat, partisan warfare, and underground operations, he possessed the psychological resiliency necessary for survival in an extreme environment. Third, Pilecki may have believed, naively as subsequent events would demonstrate, that external rescue was possible. If the Polish underground could establish contact with the Home Army's leadership, perhaps military forces could be assembled for a prisoner liberation operation. Witold approved Pilecki's plan for infiltration. The operational security was absolute. Almost no one in TAP was informed of Pilecki's true mission. The plan was simple and direct. Pilecki would position himself to be arrested by German security forces during one of the routine roundups that German occupiers conducted in Warsaw. Using his false identity as Tomasz Serafiński, he would be processed into the German police detention system and, like other Polish prisoners, likely be transported to Auschwitz. The plan presumed that Pilecki, once imprisoned, could begin organizing an underground military network among fellow Polish prisoners who were already imprisoned there. In September 1940, Pilecki prepared for his infiltration mission. He arranged his personal affairs, ensuring his wife Maria and their young children would be provided for during his absence, though he never explicitly informed them of his true whereabouts or his mission. He burned potentially incriminating documents. He memorized contact information for underground networks. On September 19, 1940, using his false identity, Pilecki allowed himself to be arrested by German security forces during a Warsaw street roundup. On the night of September 21-22, 1940, he was transported to Auschwitz concentration camp as prisoner number 4859. Pilecki's infiltration had begun. What he would witness, survive, and subsequently report would constitute the first comprehensive eyewitness account of the Holocaust to reach the Western Allies.
When Witold Pilecki arrived at Auschwitz on the night of September 21st, 22nd, 1940, the camp was still in its early stages of development. The facility had been established only 3 months earlier, in June 1940, initially to hold Polish political prisoners and military prisoners of war. Auschwitz, or KL Auschwitz in German military designation, occupied a location in southern Poland near the town of Oświęcim in the former Austro-Hungarian province of Galicia. The camp's initial capacity was approximately 2,000 prisoners, held in converted Polish army barracks surrounded by electrified barbed wire fences and guard towers. Upon arrival, Pilecki was assigned prisoner number 4859. Like all new arrivals, he underwent the brutal processing routine: delousing, confiscation of personal possessions, assignment of prisoner clothing, and placement in a barrack block. The initial conditions at Auschwitz, while terrible, were not yet the industrial genocide apparatus they would become. Prisoners were subjected to starvation rations, brutal treatment by German guards and kapos, prisoner overseers, and slave labor assignments. Death rates were high, driven by malnutrition, disease, unsanitary conditions, and frequent executions. Yet the camp was not yet equipped with gas chambers. Killings occurred primarily through shooting, torture, overwork, and disease. Pilecki began his mission immediately. Using his false Polish identity and drawing on his officer experience in underground organizations, he began identifying fellow Polish prisoners, particularly officers and educated personnel, who might be recruited for a clandestine military resistance organization. His approach was methodical and cautious. He understood that German security services actively infiltrated prisoner organizations, seeking information. He proceeded with exceptional security consciousness, recruiting only those he trusted completely and arranging meetings only in circumstances where surveillance was unlikely. By early 1941, Pilecki had established the foundation of a resistance network called the Union of Military Organization, Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, or ZWO. The organizational structure was deliberately compartmentalized. ZWO was organized into 5-man cells, with leadership deliberately separated from lower-level membership. This cell structure meant that if one cell was compromised, the entire organization would not be exposed. Pilecki personally formed the original 5 senior 5-man units that constituted ZWO's leadership. These senior units included educated Polish officers with command experience and demonstrated reliability. ZWO's fundamental objectives were threefold. First, to maintain Polish military discipline, organization, and morale among Polish prisoners despite the dehumanizing conditions of captivity. Second, to gather intelligence about Auschwitz's structure, German guard rotations, security procedures, and prisoner populations, with the intention of eventually communicating this intelligence to Polish underground headquarters in Warsaw and potentially to Western intelligence services. Third, to prepare for potential military action, either a prisoner uprising coordinated with an external relief force or organized escape operations. By March 1942, ZWO had expanded to approximately 500 members, making it one of the largest organized resistance networks in any Nazi concentration camp. ZWO's membership included Poles of various backgrounds, officers, intellectuals, priests, workers. Importantly, Pilecki ensured that ZWO penetrated key positions within the camp's internal administration. ZWO members served as functionaries in the camp's hospital ward, in the administrative blocks, and in work details that gave them access to information about prisoner movements, German security procedures, and camp commander intentions. In February 1941, another resistance organization emerged within Auschwitz, the Union of Armed Struggle, WWZ, which was the underground military organization operating throughout occupied Poland. ZWZ was established in Auschwitz by Lieutenant Colonel Kazimierz Rawicz under the assumed prisoner identity of Jan Hilkner. In autumn 1941, Pilecki established a formal agreement with Rawicz, whereby Rawicz, being the higher-ranking officer, assumed overall command of both ZWO and ZWZ within the camp, though Pilecki retained operational control of ZWO's day-to-day activities. This consolidation strengthened the unified underground military organization. Pilecki also implemented practical support programs for prisoners. ZWO members who worked in the camp kitchens carefully divided rations to provide supplemental nutrition to fellow members. ZWO coordinated the distribution of stolen clothing and blankets. The organization maintained discipline and mutual support systems to sustain prisoner morale despite the relentless dehumanization. Crucially, Pilecki established a covert communications system to transmit intelligence to the outside world. ZWO members working in various camp details made contact with Polish civilians employed as slave laborers in nearby German industrial facilities. Through these civilian workers, Pilecki transmitted detailed written reports about Auschwitz conditions, prisoner populations, guard procedures, and German treatment of prisoners. The first such report reached Polish underground headquarters in Warsaw in March 1941, transmitted via the Anna Base Intelligence Center in neutral Sweden to General Stefan Groth-Rowecki, commander of the Union of Armed Struggle and de facto leader of Polish military resistance. In June 1942, Pilecki participated in organizing an extraordinary escape operation.
4 Polish prisoners, Eugeniusz Bandera, Kazimierz Piechowski, Stanisław Jaster, and Józef Limpart, escaped from Auschwitz while disguised as members of the SS Totenkopfverbände, SS Death's Head Guard Unit. They stole an SS staff car belonging to Camp Commandant Rudolf Haas and drove directly through the main gate, successfully escaping. Jaster, a ZWO member, carried with him detailed documentation written by Pilecki, describing camp conditions. All 4 successfully escaped the Germans' reach. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, ZWO continued to operate despite escalating German security measures. A massive typhus epidemic struck in summer 1942, killing hundreds of prisoners, including over a dozen ZWO members. Nevertheless, the organization adapted and persevered. By late 1942, ZWO's membership had grown to approximately 1,000 members, operating throughout both Auschwitz I and the newly established Auschwitz II-Birkenau complex, which had been constructed beginning in 1941 as a massive extension of the original camp. However, Pilecki increasingly recognized that external relief was unlikely. Repeated requests to Polish Home Army headquarters for military action to liberate Auschwitz had been rejected as militarily impractical. Intelligence reports transmitted to the West seemed to have no effect on Allied policy. By early 1943, Pilecki concluded that his mission could only be completed by personal escape and direct contact with Home Army leadership in Warsaw to advocate for a military operation.
By spring 1943, Witold Pilecki had spent nearly 2.5 years imprisoned at Auschwitz. He had witnessed the camp's transformation from an initial internment facility holding primarily Polish prisoners to an expanding complex increasingly dedicated to mass extermination. In 1942, Auschwitz had been designated as a primary extermination site for European Jews. The gas chambers of Auschwitz II-Birkenau, fully operational by early 1943, were processing hundreds of thousands of Jewish prisoners shipped in from across occupied Europe. Pilecki and his fellow ZOW members had documented the systematic killing program through their positions within the camp administration. By late March 1943, Pilecki made a critical decision. He would escape from Auschwitz. His reasons were multiple. First, he feared that his true identity might be discovered. German security services were increasingly investigating clandestine prisoner organizations. Second, he recognized that his detailed intelligence reports, though regularly transmitted to Polish underground headquarters, seemed to be disregarded or disbelieved by Western Allied governments and Polish military leadership. Third, Pilecki believed that a personal appearance before Home Army Command in Warsaw might persuade military leaders to authorize an armed liberation operation. These factors combined to convince Pilecki that his continued presence in Auschwitz served no further purpose. He needed to escape and advocate directly for military intervention. Pilecki coordinated his escape with 2 fellow prisoners, Edward Czesialski, prisoner number 12969, and Jan Redje, prisoner number 5430. All 3 men arranged transfers to a work detail at the camp bakery, which was located outside the main camp perimeter, approximately 2 kilometers north of the main compound. The bakery represented a unique security opportunity. It was less heavily guarded than the main camp, and work details there had somewhat greater freedom of movement. On the night of April 26-27, 1943, Pilecki, Czesialski, and Redje executed their escape. While working in the bakery building, the 3 men carefully cut the camp's telephone and alarm wires, ensuring that guards could not immediately alert pursuit forces. Using a bump key, a technique requiring exceptional expertise, they opened locked doors from the inside. They manually slid back the bolts locking the bakery's main exit. Once outside, they immediately barricaded the door behind them, creating a brief delay that would complicate German pursuit. The 3 men then ran directly eastward, away from the camp. That night, the 3 escapees managed to cross the Sola River, then the Vistula River, the major natural barriers surrounding Auschwitz. They located an abandoned boat and used it to cross the Vistula. The Germans had destroyed most bridges in the region to prevent Polish guerrilla movement. After spending an entire day resting in nearby forests, Pilecki, Czesialski,
and Redje continued their eastward march. They had to cross approximately 80 kilometers of German-occupied territory to reach the general government's administrative border, a region under German control but with somewhat less intensive security than the immediate Auschwitz region. During their escape, Pilecki was wounded in a skirmish with a German patrol, but the wound was not severe enough to prevent continued movement. After several days of difficult terrain crossing through forests and marshes, the three escapees finally crossed the border of the general government near the town of Bochna. They immediately established contact with the regional headquarters of the Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa, the dominant Polish resistance organization that had absorbed the secret Polish army and other underground formations. At the Home Army's Krakow district headquarters, Pilecki presented an urgent proposal. The underground military should organize an armed assault force to attack the SS garrison at Auschwitz and liberate the remaining prisoners. He provided detailed information about camp security, guard rotations, fence vulnerabilities, and the approximate number of prisoners. The proposal was presented to regional AK commanders, but their response was negative. The commanders concluded that such an operation was militarily unrealistic, given the available forces, weapons, and fortifications. They reasoned that the SS garrison, though relatively small, was heavily armed and positioned within fortified structures. A prisoner uprising or external assault would result in massive prisoner casualties and likely fail militarily. Moreover, the Home Army was operating under severe resource constraints and could not allocate forces to such a risky operation. Pilecki then traveled to Warsaw to present his case to Home Army National Headquarters. In August 1943, he met with senior Home Army commanders, including representatives of the organization's Leadership Council. Again, Pilecki presented his detailed reports and advocated for a military liberation operation. Again, he was rejected. Home Army leaders explained that they lacked the military capacity, that such an operation lacked support from Western Allied military planners, and that the plan was too risky given the Auschwitz camp size and defenses. Disappointed but not defeated, Pilecki submitted his comprehensive written report about Auschwitz conditions, which became known as Witold's Report or the Rapport W, Report W. This document, based on nearly 2.5 years of careful observation and intelligence gathering by Pilecki and ZOW, constituted the first comprehensive eyewitness account of the Holocaust to reach the Western Allies. The report documented prisoner populations, death rates, killing methods including gas chambers, German guard structures, and the deliberate extermination program targeting European Jews. Pilecki distributed copies of his report to Home Army headquarters, which transmitted it through underground courier networks and eventually to the Polish government in exile in London. Western intelligence services received the document, yet despite its unprecedented documentation of genocide, the report was received with skepticism by some Western officials, who found Pilecki's accounts difficult to believe. Some believed Pilecki was exaggerating, others dismissed the accounts as propaganda. Following his report submission in Warsaw, Pilecki engaged in additional underground resistance activities. He joined various Home Army sabotage operations while maintaining contact with surviving ZOW members still imprisoned at Auschwitz. In 1944, when the Polish Home Army launched the Warsaw Uprising against German occupation, Pilecki volunteered as a common soldier. Only after several officers were killed in combat did he reveal his rank and assume command of a combat company.
The transmission of Witold's report to Western Allied leadership in 1943-1944 presented a profound historical paradox. Here existed the first comprehensive, detailed eyewitness account of the Holocaust, documentary evidence of industrial-scale genocide produced by an intelligence officer of proven reliability and military authority. Yet despite this unprecedented documentation, the report failed to generate significant Allied military response or change Allied policy toward the Jewish persecution being documented. The distribution of Witold's report followed multiple pathways. The Polish government in exile in London received copies through Polish underground courier networks. British intelligence services obtained the document. American intelligence received information derived from the report. The International Red Cross was informed of the report's contents. Yet the response from Western governments was constrained by several factors. First, some Western officials expressed skepticism about the report's accuracy, finding the documented killing rates and systematic extermination program almost incomprehensible, a psychological barrier that would persist among Allied leadership throughout the war. Second, Western governments, particularly Britain and the United States, maintained restrictive immigration policies toward Jewish refugees, limiting the practical options available for rescue operations. Third, Allied military leadership prioritized the defeat of Germany through conventional military operations and was reluctant to allocate resources to discrete rescue operations that might delay the general war effort. Critically, the Western Allies rejected Pilecki's specific proposal for a military liberation operation at Auschwitz. From a pure military calculation, the decision was understandable. Auschwitz lay deep within German-occupied territory, surrounded by other German military installations, and could not be reached by Allied ground forces until the Soviet Red Army advanced into Poland in January 1945, at which point most prisoners capable of travel had already been evacuated or murdered. Yet the rejection of Pilecki's advocacy for prisoner rescue represented a strategic choice by Allied leadership to prioritize general military victory over discrete rescue operations, a decision that remains historically controversial. The existence of Witold's report did have some documented impact. The report contributed to a growing body of intelligence evidence about Nazi genocide that gradually accumulated through 1943-1944. Multiple intelligence sources, including other Auschwitz escapees, intercepted German communications, underground networks, and reports from Vatican sources progressively documented the Holocaust. In April 1943, the Bermuda Conference brought together American and British representatives ostensibly to coordinate refugee policy, but the conference produced minimal practical results. In November 1943, the Moscow Declaration, signed by Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, specifically mentioned Nazi crimes in Poland and promised that war criminals would be tried after the war. Yet the declaration did not commit to specific rescue operations or military intervention. Notably, Witold's report predated by approximately 2 years another significant witness account, the Auschwitz Protocols, compiled by Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler, who escaped from Auschwitz in April 1944 and provided detailed documentation to Western Jewish organizations. The Verba-Wetzler account received somewhat greater international attention than Pilecki's report, partly because it reached Western Jewish organizations that possessed media connections, and partly because it provided specific information about the systematic murder of Hungarian Jews during the German occupation of Hungary in 1944. Yet despite the accumulation of multiple witness accounts, Western Allied military strategy remained focused on the defeat of Germany through conventional warfare rather than discrete rescue operations. From a tactical perspective, the failure of Western Allies to mount a military rescue operation at Auschwitz did not significantly alter the war's ultimate outcome. Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, discovering approximately 7,000 surviving prisoners. However, the majority of Auschwitz prisoners had been killed or evacuated before Soviet liberation. The camp's total death toll reached approximately 1 to 1.3 million prisoners, including approximately 960,000 Jews. Over 140,000 Poles were deported to Auschwitz. Approximately 75,000 were killed. The failure to mount a rescue operation meant that Auschwitz operated for approximately another 2 years after Pilecki's escape. 2 years during which hundreds of thousands of additional prisoners, particularly European Jews, were systematically exterminated. Pilecki's role in this historical tragedy was that of a messenger whose message was disbelieved or disregarded. He had successfully infiltrated the Nazi genocide apparatus, documented its mechanisms and death tolls, and transmitted this information to Western leadership. Yet the institutional, political, and military constraints facing Western governments prevented translation of this knowledge into effective rescue action. Pilecki himself continued to serve in Polish resistance activities. During the Warsaw Uprising of August to October 1944, he served as a combat officer, fighting street by street against German forces. He was captured by German forces during the uprising and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war in German camps, surviving until the war's conclusion in May 1945.
Pilecki was liberated by Allied forces from a German prisoner of war camp in May 1945. He returned to Poland expecting to be recognized as a war hero. However, Poland's political future had been determined at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, where Stalin secured Soviet dominance over Eastern Europe. Poland fell within the Soviet sphere of influence, and a communist Polish government, installed with Soviet support, replaced the democratic Polish government in exile that had operated in London. For Polish resistance fighters and officers who had served governments opposed to Soviet domination, this political transformation created profound danger.
Witold Pilecki's liberation from German captivity in May 1945 marked not an ending to his suffering, but rather a transition to a different form of persecution. As Allied forces advanced into Eastern Europe, Soviet forces under Stalin's command secured dominant military and political control over Poland and much of Eastern Europe. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945 and the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Western leaders, particularly American President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, effectively ceded Poland to Soviet domination in exchange for Soviet military assistance against Germany and commitment to eventual Soviet entry into the war against Japan. The result was the imposition of a communist Polish government installed with Soviet support. This government, dominated by Polish communists trained in Moscow and Soviet-controlled secret police, viewed Polish Home Army officers and resistance fighters not as heroes, but as potential obstacles to Soviet domination and communist consolidation of power. Soldiers and officers who had fought against the Nazis while maintaining loyalty to the Polish government in exile in London, which had opposed both German and Soviet imperialism, became targets of communist persecution. Pilecki, despite his recognized status as a resistance officer and Auschwitz survivor, represented a particular threat to communist authority. As an Auschwitz survivor, he possessed the historical knowledge and credibility to document Nazi atrocities, knowledge that implicitly contrasted with the communist narrative that portrayed communism as the sole opposing force to fascism. As a Home Army officer loyal to the London government, Pilecki represented the old Polish state order that communists sought to erase. Moreover, his documented communications with Polish military units in the West and his continued identification with the Polish government in exile made him vulnerable to charges of being a Western spy, a charge that communist secret police used to justify persecution of anti-communist Poles. On May 8, 1947, Polish communist security forces arrested Pilecki. The arrest was conducted violently. Pilecki was interrogated for months by communist secret police, subjected to torture designed to extract confessions to fabricated charges. The regime accused Pilecki of espionage on behalf of the Western Allies and the Polish government in exile, collaboration with General Władysław Anders, commander of the Polish Second Corps, who had fought alongside the Western Allies, planning to assassinate communist officials, and various other charges designed to paint him as a traitor to Poland. Pilecki was subjected to psychological and physical torture intended to break his will and produce false confessions. Despite the extreme brutality, Pilecki refused to implicate other resistance fighters in his confessions. The communist secret police failed to extract from him detailed information about other underground members. In March 1948, the communist regime staged a show trial, a propaganda spectacle rather than a genuine legal proceeding. Pilecki was not permitted to present a meaningful defense. Witnesses sympathetic to Pilecki were not allowed to testify. The court's composition violated Polish law. Judges included military officers who had themselves served in the Home Army, yet they now served the communist regime. The predetermined outcome was conviction and death sentence. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed by gunshot to the back of his head in the basement of Warsaw's Mokotów prison on Rakowicka Street.
His body was disposed of in an undiscovered grave. The communist regime suppressed information about his arrest, trial, and execution. Official Polish media made no announcement of his death. For decades, Pilecki effectively disappeared from Polish public consciousness, his heroic wartime accomplishments erased from official history by the communist regime he had lived to oppose. However, Pilecki's legacy could not be permanently suppressed. Polish intellectuals, particularly those who maintain contact with Western academic institutions, gradually pieced together the historical record of Pilecki's wartime activities and post-war persecution. In the 1960s and 1970s, as Cold War tensions moderated somewhat and Polish society developed greater intellectual autonomy, Polish historians and journalists began documenting Pilecki's story. His reports from Auschwitz, preserved in archives outside Poland, became available to Western historians researching the Holocaust and Polish resistance. The fall of communism in Poland in 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union created the opportunity for historical reassessment. In the 1990s, as Poland transitioned to democracy and historical truth became increasingly accessible, Pilecki's wartime heroism and communist-era persecution were recognized and publicly honored. In 2005, the Polish government formally acknowledged Pilecki's historical significance and officially pardoned him of the fabricated charges under which he had been convicted. A symbolic act of historical justice, though it could not restore his life. Today, Witold Pilecki is recognized as one of the most significant figures of Polish resistance and one of the most courageous witnesses to the Holocaust. He is commemorated in Poland through monuments, memorials, and educational programs. International Holocaust memorials acknowledge his role in documenting Nazi atrocities. Military historians recognize his organizational accomplishments in establishing and maintaining WWO, the underground military organization he created within Auschwitz itself, an extraordinary achievement of leadership under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Pilecki's historical legacy encompasses multiple dimensions. First, he documented the Holocaust before most of the world understood its full scope, providing the first comprehensive eyewitness account of industrial genocide. Second, he demonstrated that resistance and armed organization were possible even within the most totalitarian systems of control. Third, his life exemplifies the costs of anti-totalitarian resistance. He survived Nazi persecution only to be persecuted by communist authorities. Fourth, his story illustrates the tragedy of Eastern Europe's history. Nations that sacrificed massively in defeat of fascism only to experience decades of communist oppression. Witold Pilecki's final legacy is philosophical and moral. The proposition that individual conscience, courage, and commitment to truth can persist even against overwhelming state power and organizational totalitarianism. His voluntary infiltration of Auschwitz, his meticulous documentation of genocide, his continued resistance to communist persecution despite torture, and his ultimate sacrifice represent human capacity for heroism in confrontation with historical evil.